Lords of the Underground, Keepers of the Funk. It's been a while. Welcome to It's Been a While. I'm Free Tillman. This is a series where I talk about albums that I loved as a kid, but for whatever reason I stopped listening to them. And today we're talking about Keepers of the Funk by Lords of the Underground. Before I continue, if you've watched more than 2 of these videos and you still haven't subscribed, why don't you take a second and do that right now. Hit the notification bell to be notified when I upload new videos, and don't forget to like and leave a comment. Feel free to say whatever you want. If it's a nice comment, I'll like it, and if it's a mean comment, I'll just delete it. It's a win-win for everybody. And in case you've done all of that stuff, how about you tap somebody on the shoulder and show them this cool new show that you've been watching? Okay, back to Lords of the Underground. Their debut album, Here Come the Lords, is probably more well remembered. It has some of their biggest hits like Chief Rocker and Funky Child. But I want to talk about Keepers of the Funk because this was the first album that I heard from them. The only reason why I didn't hear Here Come the Lords first was because in 1993, I didn't have any money. But in 1994, I did, so I bought the cassette. I eventually did hear Here Come the Lords, but because Keepers of the Funk was the first one that I heard, this is the album that I think of when I think of Lords of the Underground. The reason I stopped listening to it is because I eventually got rid of my cassettes, and because the album is now out of print, I never had a chance to pick it up again. In fact, only 2 of their 4 albums is available on streaming services. Nowadays, when I do hear Lords of the Underground, it's a single from Here Come the Lords that gets played. So it's been a good 20 years since I've heard this album in its entirety. So let's see if it still hits the same. This album starts out with Ready or Not, and the first thing I noticed about this song was the Spanish percussion that they somehow turned into boom bap. I will admit the Do It All's flow does sound a bit dated, and I honestly wasn't on board with the song until I heard Mr. Funky. And I think it's his nasally voice that somehow makes everything he says sound more urgent. So I have to make a confession. Some of you may remember the posse cut A Bunch of Niggas from Heavy D's album Blue Funk. It features Third Eye, Robbo, Guru, and Busta Rhymes fresh off his breakup with leaders of the New School. This song is probably most famous for being the major label debut of the Notorious B.I.G. And I'll admit, when I first heard Biggie's verse, I assumed it was Mr. Funky. Their flows at the time were identical, and they both had this nasally tone to their voice. Biggie was obviously a fan. I mean, he used Mr. Funky's voice on Machine Gun Funk, and the group was supposed to be on Ready to Die, but it never happened. A recurring theme in Lords of the Underground songs is that people are constantly stealing their style. And as far as I can tell, the only people they actually had beef with was Dod's Effects. But I always felt like Biggie, at least in the very beginning of his career, was definitely influenced by Mr. Funky. At any rate, this was a solid start to the album. Next we have the first single from the album, TikTok, produced by Marley Marl. Unfortunately, this was their last song to chart on the Billboard 100, and it's a pretty straightforward Lords of the Underground track. The title track, Keepers of the Funk, features none other than George Clinton, who had seen a resurgence in the early 90s after Dr. Dre became a superstar. But his relevance never really went away, with artists like EPMD and Digital Underground constantly referencing him. Clinton did plenty of work keeping his own name alive by appearing in movies and TV shows and collaborating with tons of newer artists. In fact, in 1993, Clinton had just released his 6th solo album, Hey Man, Smell My Finger, on Prince's Paisley Park imprint. What makes his collaboration special, at least to me, is that Clinton, who grew up in Plainsville, was now working with fellow New Jersey natives. One thing that I always found weird about Lords of the Underground is that I never found them to be that funky. Obviously, this track is funky. It's impossible to not be funky when you're on a song with George Clinton. But most of their production has always been more jazz or soul inspired. Their music is funky in a general sense in that it makes your head nod, but not in the way that like DJ Quick or Dale the Funky Homo Sapien is funky. This song also marks the first time that I ever heard the term arm, leg, leg, arm, head. Steam from the Knot is a solo joint from Do It All, and it features dark production from K-Def. The premise of the song is that someone got Mr. Funky. I don't know if it's literal or if they just wanted to create a story, but either way, Do It All definitely holds its own on this one. What I'm After is the second single from the album, and the song is about gaining more success after their first album. Do It All even says, as long as the rhymes are fatter, I bet Billboard has me top of the ladder. Ironically, this single didn't chart on Billboard's Top 100, which is a shame because this is one of my favorite singles by them. The track listing says it features Redman, but it's a sample from Tonight's Tonight. He does appear in the video though, and just in case you didn't know, Redman was Do It All's DJ back in the day until Redman went on to become like the greatest rapper of all time. Faith is the third single from the album, and it was produced by Lords of the Underground as opposed to being produced by Marley Marl or K-Def. And it actually features Denise Williams singing the hook, whose song Free is the main sample for the track. I think the song is a nice breather from everything else that's going on the album. One thing that I found odd about this song is that even though Lords of the Underground barely curse on any of their songs, Mr. Funky couldn't refrain from saying ass on a track that pretty much is a Christian rap song. I guess they didn't want that faith-based money. The B-side to Faith was Never Faded, and for some reason every single that was released from this album charted lower and lower. And I'm going to blame the record company because Lords of the Underground definitely held up their end of the bargain. Never Faded is easily one of their best singles, and the video for this one is one of the greatest low-budget one-take videos ever made with no fake cuts. I'm looking at you, Dunkirk. Do It All and Mr. Funky provide monstrous verses, while the featured artist Supreme C provides a grittier sound that you normally don't get on a Lords of the Underground track. It's a shame that this one didn't get the push it deserved. Feel No Pain is a duet between Mr. Funky and Sabi. Sabi was featured on Here Come the Lords on the song Flow On. She was supposed to release her debut album in 1994, but sadly it was shelved. The album finishes out with Frustrated, Yes Y'all, and What You See, which are pretty straightforward tracks. I'll be honest, by the time I got to What You See, the production was starting to feel a little stale, but Do It All and Mr. Funky's playful back and forth lyrics made for a fun listen. It's funny, I haven't listened to this album in over 20 years, but there are still lyrics from every one of these songs that I remember vividly. Even though it didn't have as many hit singles, I actually enjoyed this album more than Here Come the Lords, and I think it has a lot to do with K-Def's production. I'm definitely glad I went back to this one. So, when's the last time you heard Keepers of the Funk? Are you still bumping it to this day? I'm going to keep talking about albums until I run out. Until then, I am Free Tillman, the only guy on the internet that doesn't know everything.